Hey everyone, it's Jonathan, and welcome to an episode I've wanted to do for quite some time. This is a movie I grew up with, 1995's The Wind in the Willows. For kids who grew up in the 90s, I'm sure you'll know, when your family owns just a handful of VHS tapes, you watch those ones to death. And this was one of those for me and my brothers. I never fully read the book until I started this podcast series, but this version is why I love this story so much. From the background art to the character design to the voiced cast to the music, this is such a perfect encapsulation of the story. It's not a perfect adaptation, as I've discovered now having read the book myself, but it gets the vibes right, and that's one of the most important parts of adapting something for me. Joining me for this episode is my cousin Sarah. She is also a huge fan of this story, not because she grew up watching it. I don't think she'd ever seen this version until we watched it for this podcast, but she loves the book, and when I started working on a series on Wind in the Willows, I knew I wanted her to join me for this one. And not just this one, but next week we'll be back to talk about the sequel, which I had never seen, and as a kid I didn't even know existed, so it was interesting to see how that held up to the original. But before we get to that, let's talk about my version of The Wind in the Willows, the 1995 British animated version, produced coincidentally by one of Sarah's favorite filmmakers, John Coates, who did one of her favorite Christmas films, The Snowman, as well as one of her favorite animated series, The World of Beatrix Potter and Friends. Once she discovered that this one was by the same person who made those, she was excited to watch this one as well. This is the version I grew up with, so...
Lucky you.
Other than an excerpted chapter that was in, like, a childcraft book, this was my main exposure to this story as a kid.
I don't feel like I had a lot of exposure to it as a kid. I might have been a teenager or in my 20s when I got the book. But I've had plenty of exposure since then.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I remember some sort of horrifying live version on PBS, and other than that, I don't think I watched much animated to do with it.
Okay.
But yeah, if you were going to be raised with an animated version, this seems like one of the best ones that you could be raised on.
Yeah, I really liked it, watching it through again. It's one of those things where you start watching like, is this going to hold up to my memories? And I think it did.
Good. No, and well, you got me on board pretty quickly because it's John Coates, who also did The World of Beatrix Potter and Friends and Snowman, both of which I love.
I noticed there was a lot of people, like when I was doing the research for this, there was a lot of people in the voice cast who also did voices on The World of Beatrix Potter and Friends.
The mole is Timmy Willie. I recognize that.
Yep. Well, we can go through the cast. We have Vanessa Redgrave as the narrator.
Which I loved that.
Yes.
She was wonderful. And
I was trying to think, like, where else do I know Vanessa Redgrave from? Because I know the name. Like, she's... Like, you hear the voice and, like, it's Vanessa Redgrave. I was going through her IMDb and was like, is this movie why I know her?
Oh, maybe.
I saw things that, I vaguely recognized. She was in Mission Impossible and Cars 2.
Really?
But, like... I don't remember who she was in either of those, and I'm not even sure I've seen the first Mission Impossible movie.
I've never even watched the whole thing of Letters to Juliet, but I loved her on that movie.
Is that movie I watched part of with you? I don't remember if we ever finished it.
I don't know, but she was lovely on there. And she does get a happy ending. So...
Oh, that's good.
Yes. So having her translate over to this... I mean, there's a part on there where she is reading a letter, and it's really, really nice, and maybe that helps in my mind to translate her over to this, where she is the narrator. And yeah, she's cozy.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that they're setting it up in that era with that wonderful steamboat that would be so fun to ride on.
I was thinking it would be fun to ride on that thing too.
And I think there's a phonograph, and yeah, it's just very charming.
Yeah. I was kind of wondering if maybe that opening was inspired by the various versions of Alice in Wonderland that have the boat ride.
I mean, so much of the book is on the river that it just makes sense for them to be on the river at the beginning.
Yeah.
But there aren't any steamboats. It's just a very charming touch.
The kids, when I first saw them, I was like you could tell they were not professional
I think
actors.
I mean, for this, it's not like they had to do an hour's worth of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
They're setting it up and capping off the story, so it's not like they had any really hammy dramatics that they needed to go into. And they were not doing like a youth group reading of their lines. And if you... some people will know what I'm talking about, like that you're holding the sheet and this is how we're talking through the story, and it doesn't matter what emotions we're supposed to convey, we're reading it off of the sheet.
Yes.
So, no, it's better than that.
Well, I did think it was interesting. The only one who went on to do anything more was the boy, who is Tim Storton as Edward, which I didn't remember any of their names. I had to look the names up on IMDb. But he has a pretty long IMDb page, but it all seems to be like tiny roles. And he seems to be like a staple actor in the Thomas the Tank Engine series. But I thought it was kind of hilarious. His most recent role was as Earring Magic Ken in the Barbie movie.
Really?
I think he was one of the misfit dolls that lived with Weird Barbie.
Oh. I'm having maybe a vague remembrance.
I just thought that was kind of hilarious.
So he played that character. Yeah. Oh, now I want to know which character that. Oh, come on.
I could do a Google search.
Yeah, I want to see. I want to see what young Edward grew up to be. And if he's playing Ken, then he must have been eating his veggies or something. Oh my. Fun.
Yeah, that's basically it for the live action cast. For the characters, the main characters, Alan Bennett is Maul, and as you already said, Timmy Willie in The World of Beatrix Potter and Friends.
One of my favorite characters. So cute.
And I had to look all these people up, of course. Some of them I thought I might recognize the voice, but for him, the biggest surprise was that he was the mouse in the 1966 Jonathan Miller BBC Alice in Wonderland. The black and white one.
Timmy Willie was?
Yeah.
So he's basically very good with the cute animal role.
Apparently.
The only other voice that I recognized was Badger's, but carry on, maybe I'll know somebody.
Michael Palin as Ratty. He was in Monty Python, and he also voiced the son in the Terry Gilliam Wind in the Willows, which is probably the live-action one you saw.
I might get more out of it as an adult, but it just looked so wrong growing up.
And then, of course, the biggest name was Sir Michael Gambon as Badger, who the first thing that jumped out at me was he played Franklin Bean in Fantastic Mr. Fox.
Sure.
But I also know him as Kazran Sardik in the Doctor Who Christmas Carol, which is basically the Scrooge role for that episode.
Okay. I know him from, I think, Cranford.
Yeah, that was one.
Opposite Judi Dench, and then he dies tragically. And he ate peas with a knife. No, he didn't die from that. He didn't die from that. It was just a random part of the...
Well, I'd also forgotten that he was Mr. Lawrence in the 2017 Little Women miniseries.
I also remember him from, I think, Wives and Daughters.
Mm.
And he was like a bigoted old man, and the main character was very sweet and patient with him, and he came around. And it was lovely. I mean, she was saint. She was a saint towards him.
Yeah, he has a very long list of credits, a lot of which I actually recognize, but that's what stood out to me the most was some recent things we'd watched.
If you're working with him, you're probably making something cool.
And then Rick Mayall as Mr. Toad, and the thing that jumped out at me first was he played Prince Froglip in The Princess and the Goblin, which I reviewed on the podcast last year.
Did I watch? I probably didn't.
You didn't watch that one with me. And he was also in Blackadder, and he was also somebody who was in The World of Beatrix Potter and Friends.
What was the thing that we watched with all the goblins?
Was it live action or animated?
It was animated, like from the 80s or something. And it was like maybe a George
maybe I did watch it with you.
Like
I did watch that with you. I didn't do
Yeah.
the podcast with you, but I watched it with you.
Okay.
That was it, yeah.
Yeah. So Toad was in that one.
Yes.
Which character?
Prince Froglip, the Prince of the Goblins.
Okay, so another nasty reptilian creature.
Yes. And in the world of Beatrix Potter and Friends, he played Tom Thumb, which doesn't mean anything to me, but you've seen the show, so you might know the name.
Tom Thumb. Which episode?
I don't know, I just wrote down Tom Thumb in the world of Beatrix Potter and Friends.
Oh, I know. I think he was one of the Two Bad Mice, which they did a dual episode with the Two Bad Mice and the Town and the Country Mouse with Timmy Willie. So they were basically on the same episode together.
Mm. And then the last three are a bit smaller. The person who played Otter was N. Rytel, and he did a ton of voices in the world of Peter Rabbit and Friends, like so many that I didn't even bother writing a name down.
Oh.
And then Emma Chambers as the jailer's daughter. She was Alice Tinker in The Vicar of Dibley. As soon as I heard the voice, I recognized it. And then the barge woman was played by Judy Cornwell, who played Daisy in Keeping Up Appearances.
Really?
Yes.
My brain did not register that.
It did to me. She's perfect for that kind of a character.
Mm.
I don't know if it registered for you. It's probably just because this is a nostalgic childhood thing, but to me, the opening music is like iconic.
I mean, you're watching for like 3 seconds before you recognize that you're watching something cozy.
Mm-hmm.
So between the atmosphere and the music, It's lovely. And it's nice that they set it up as a narration before the animation. They could go right into the animation, but
yeah,
that added another layer of cozy.
Yeah. What did you think of the art style of the whole thing?
Really nice.
It seemed like an illustration to me.
Didn't they have kind of the pencil stroke thing that you would have along with this kind of like the snowman?
It kind of seemed sort of mixed media. Like I could see pencils. I thought I could see crayons. There was maybe some paint.
It wasn't as sketchy as the snowman.
I think the snowman was like entirely crayon, and this wasn't. This had more stuff being used.
It was very nicely done.
Yeah.
It's interesting because at the beginning you have him digging his way out, but then when he comes back with Ratty, it's like they come in through his little courtyard. So, what was that?
The courtyard seemed to be underground.
Yes. So why didn't he go out that way in the beginning?
I don't know.
Questions that are slightly irrelevant. But they included the whitewashing.
Yes.
And they included onion sauce.
Onion sauce. Onion sauce.
Yes. Which I believe is what rabbits were served with. So it was very insulting. Because the rabbits were trying to bar his passage. And he was basically saying nonsense, and this is what you're eating with. It's one of those little things that, like, if you didn't have the footnote in the book, it's not like I grew up eating rabbit.
I don't think I've ever eaten rabbit. But yeah, this starts with the spring cleaning and Mo leaving his house to go and meet Ratty. Because I don't know if they...
in the book, you get the impression that they just didn't know each other, that this is them becoming friends.
Mm-hmm.
And this one, it's kind of hazy, like they could know each other, but do they?
The way they talk seems like they do, but also he has no idea how to get to his house and he's never been in a boat before. So, I don't know.
It's like in the book they become friends really quickly, but you don't get the impression that they knew each other.
Mm-hmm.
And then he's giving his whole speech about everything in the picnic basket, and they made the artistic choice of Otter showing up to the picnic in a little swimsuit. And
with baby Portly.
Which in the book Portly wasn't with him, but it makes sense to introduce the character then, since he's going to reappear later and establish that it's his son.
Yeah.
And Badger did have a grumpy cameo at that picnic. And then that whole little upset with the boat. Like, they stayed pretty... they did a good job conveying Mole's character in this one, and how he'll... In the book, I think you get even more of a sense of how foolhardy he is grabbing these oars, but I think they did a good job with this scene. Mm-hmm. And one thing that that doesn't happen in the book, that I recall, but that makes sense in this movie, is how he tells him, you better stay on with me and I'll teach you about, boating and things. And it sets the story up nicely for him to stay with him.
You also had a couple brief scenes on the river there with Otter telling them about Toad, who seems to be currently obsessed with boats. And then when Portly jumps into the river to go after a dragonfly, I love the way you see the little shadow swimming under the river and then the dragonfly gets sucked downwards.
Sometimes it's little touches.
And the story is told by seasons, so that was spring, and now we're moving into summer, where Mole has stayed with Rat for a while, and they decide to go visit Toad. And I thought it was funny because they get to Toad Hall, and they see this boathouse full of boats, and Ratty seems to be annoyed that he's given up boats, and he asks him about it. He goes, "Oh, pooh, boating? Gave that up a long time ago."
Naturally. And it seems kind of obscure for them to include the cart thing, but it always sets, anytime that's included, which since I have not watched a zillion versions, but I would imagine that they have included it in a bunch, it just sets it up for his car obsession. Mm-hmm. And they did a good job with that. Yeah.
Basically going on a early 1900s road trip.
Yes.
Which actually seems like a fun idea. I liked that cart. It seemed like it had a good stash of stuff.
It was slow camping.
Yeah. And Rat doesn't want to go, but Mole kind of convinces him. And I'm not sure how long they travel with Toad.
I think in the book you get the impression that Rat already knows that this is a load of nonsense, and he already knows Toad well enough, but he could see that Mole was interested, and so he's doing it for Mole's sake. And no, it's not long-lived in the book or in this movie.
Well, I felt like it was long enough that Mole could sense that Rat didn't want to be there, because they have that conversation, and Rat basically decides, no, we should stay with Toad because we have to watch out for him.
You already have it set up early on that just how nice, like, they have their, moments, their little foibles, but just how loyal and kind Rat and Mole are to each other in general is really, it's a nice part of the story.
Yeah. But then after that conversation, the next day is when you get the motor car, causing them to have a crash. And you've got Rat running after the car, screaming after them. And then Mole is trying to calm the horse. And Toad is just sitting there, his eyes glazing over and getting hypnotized.
Obsessed.
And he doesn't, at least on screen, he doesn't immediately go out and get a car. You go back with Mole and Rat. And you've got a scene with Rat starting to write poetry, and Mole kind of accidentally insulting his poetry.
They set this up for him to be... they did a good job with this, because they were trying... Because there's this whole passage in the book talking to the birds that are going to be going south, and then he runs into this sea rat who fills his head with all of these adventures that he's had, and then he's in this daze like he needs to leave too. And they bypass that by having him get grumpy at Mole and long for an adventure, and like he's going to go off in a daze and have this adventure, and then Mole talking him out of it very briefly about, the lovely things that he would be missing. It's more It's like 1 or 2 chapters in the book, but
This was a brief scene.
But it was nice that they included all of the lovely animation to go with these adventures that he thought about having.
Yeah.
They did a good job with that. They just creatively compacted it.
Mm-hmm.
But I love the scene talking to the swallows that are talking about leaving. But it's okay that they didn't have it.
I was thinking about that, not the swallows in particular, but I was wondering, I think I was like halfway through the second movie, I was like, are there any birds in this world? Like talking birds?
Yes. In the book there are. But yeah, in here I don't know. Maybe not.
I guess not. I don't remember seeing any talking birds. You do see birds, like in this scene, you've got birds heading south for the winter. That's what starts his imagination about going south for adventures. And then you see birds in the jail too. They build a nest and lay eggs.
But no, it's a whole conversation.
But yeah, that whole thing ends with Mole telling him he can't leave. He still has so much to teach him, and he still hasn't met Badger, which transitions to basically the end of fall, the beginning of winter. They still haven't met Badger, and Mole is getting impatient. Mm-hmm. So he decides to go out and find Badger himself, going to the Wild Wood.
He was sneaky about that in the book, and naive.
Mm-hmm. And his journey through the woods reminded me of the scene with Snow White running through the forest, with imagining that she's seeing creatures in the trees, and
except he is seeing, like, he is surrounded.
Well, he is surrounded by weasels, and you do hear them, but like there's at least one where he sees this big grove of things that looks like a pig monster, and then it switches, so you can tell it's just trees.
Sure.
But that's the main thing that reminded me of Snow White, was him imagining that he sees a big monster, and It's not really a monster.
But no, they did a good job with all the little noises and...
Yeah, the little whistles. Yeah, Rat wakes up after he's gone and hears something from the woods and goes after him. And he eventually finds him hiding in a hollow tree, saying he's exhausted, they can't leave now. So they wait, but then it starts snowing. I don't know, were they trying to leave before it got too deep? Because to me it was just like, you're in a hollow tree, just stay there until the storm is over.
I'd have to look in the book, but it may have already been snowing before. Oh shoot, I'd have to look when the snow began. Okay, it looks like this was pretty accurate to the book, of having him find him and Mole needing to rest and then discovering snow. So I was thinking that it was already going, but it doesn't really look that way.
But yeah, they head out into the snow, and Mole ends up tripping over something and I guess cutting his leg. But it turns out to be the door stopper, or door scraper. And
I recognize from this scene, Mole not getting it and being grumpy, and then Rat being short with him after Mole is praised. Like, this is so accurate to the book. It might even be word for word accurate, this whole conversation. So they did a really good job with that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they discover that they are outside Badger's house, so they ring his bell, and he is at first grumpy, but then he invites them in.
Accurate. And they did this scene a little bit differently than the book, but they did a good job. They did not capture the code. It would be so hard if you did it with the narrator overlaying the exact words of the book for this scene, at least some of the scene, to set the stage. Then you might capture the coziness of it. Mm-hmm. But without that, it's hard to do that.
Rat and Mole tell Badger about Toad, and they want to have Badger come back with them and help him see sense, but Badger doesn't want to do it until spring. It didn't seem like they stayed with him very long, but I would have thought that they would have waited until...
They stayed the night. They stayed the night, and there was a scene with 2 hedgehogs that had, I think, run into trouble getting to school, and they were there having breakfast, and Otter shows up, and there's this whole eloquent speech about nature that he goes on, and And then Mole's off with Badger discussing his house, and there's a whole wonderful talk about the rise and fall of civilizations. Not included in this version. It's okay, just read the book. But no, the time at Badger's house is it's such a great part of the book. And yeah, it would be hard to capture without some... the part about the rise and fall of civilizations is Badger talking, so it would just be a matter of, are you going to have the patience to include that?
Mm-hmm. I got the feeling that this, like, obviously this is shorter than the book, but it felt like it went by very quickly. And it is like only an hour and 10 minutes, so it did go by very quickly, but I'm sure that there was a lot of stuff in the book that they had to cut out for time.
And then I think they transitioned directly into the scene of trying to find Mole's house.
Yeah, they left and it seemed like they just went out in the snowstorm again.
And see, the thing is, that's a whole separate chunk in the book. I think maybe they'd been, and I'd have to look at it, but I think maybe they had just been off tramping or doing their own thing on an entirely different day. And you have this... It's its own chapter, and it's like a short story within the book of how they go through a human village. And then they're wanting to get home, and I mean, I think it starts with like the scurrying of sheep, and there's this whole discussion about this parrot that they can see behind a window blind or something. And just all of these little things. And on the way home, he catches the scent of his place. But it makes sense for an animated version to just smoosh it together. Mm-hmm. And this one, they didn't have the carolers. It was still nice the way they did the scene, but the carolers are a very cute part of the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they head out and Mole catches this whiff of his house and starts to feel really homesick, so they decide to go find his home. And do they stay there until spring in the book? It seemed like that's what they were doing.
They just stayed the night. Okay. As far as I know.
I also noticed that when they're going through his courtyard, there's a fountain with fish.
Yes.
I was like, how did they survive almost a year without anyone feeding them?
It's the magic of the book. I don't know. And they're underground, so...
Yeah, in winter.
I don't know.
Are they in the book? Does he have fish in the book?
Time to find the passage. Suddenly, without giving warning, he dived, but the rat was on the alert and promptly followed him down the tunnel to which his unerring nose had faithfully led him. It was close and airless, and the earthy smell was strong, and it seemed a long time to Rat ere the passage ended, and he could stand erect and stretch and shake himself. The Mole struck a match, and by its light the Rat saw that they were standing in an open space, neatly swept and sanded underfoot, and directly facing them was Mole's little front door, with Mole End painted in Gothic lettering over the bell-pull at the side. Mole reached down a lantern from a nail on the wall and lit it, and the Rat, looking round him, saw that they were in a sort of forecourt. A garden seat stood on one side of the door, and on the other a roller, for the Mole, who was a tidy animal when at home, could not stand having his ground kicked up by other animals into little runs that ended in earth heaps. On the walls hung wire baskets with ferns in them, alternating with brackets carrying plaster statuary. Is it Garibaldi? Garibaldi, and the infant Samuel, and Queen Victoria, and other heroes of modern Italy. Down on one side of the forecourt ran a skittle alley, with benches along it, and little wooden tables marked with rings that hinted at beer mugs. In the middle was a small round pond containing goldfish, and surrounded by a cockle-shell border. Out of the center of the pond rose a fanciful erection clothed in more cockle-shells, and topped by a large silvered glass ball that reflected everything all wrong and had a very pleasing effect. So when you look at this animated scene, even though they're not explaining all the things, they did a pretty good job of, like, they were trying to show his little forecourt.
Yeah. It seemed very fancy and well kept for something that hadn't seen anyone in almost a year. Well, eventually they go back to Rats, and in the spring, Badger comes so they can go confront Toad. And apparently Badger has heard that a new motor car is scheduled to be delivered that morning. So they go to restrain Toad, and they turn away the car. And I love the scene where they've got him inside, and he's pretending to be like all contrite and remorseful, and he solemnly promises that the next time I see a motor car, off I go in it!
They did a good job of capturing the essence of the scene, because he was briefly repentant, then unrepentant, and then they were trying to watch over him and keep him stuck at home, but they had him escape very quickly in this version, which is fine. It was funny the way they did it.
Uh-huh. That's like one of my favorite scenes from when I was a kid. Just them locking him in his room, and he's like having a literal screaming tantrum. Then he gets an idea and starts giggling evilly to himself, tying bed sheets together and jumping out the window.
And then they made it like he was trying to get away from them by stealing the car, whereas in the book I think it was just his stupid temptation to mess around with the car. But because didn't they have it more like he was trying to get away from...
Basically, yeah. He's fleeing towards town, and they're just catching up to him, and they see him jump into a car, and you hear somebody yelling that that's their car, and he crashes immediately. And then you get the scene in the court where he's sentenced to 12 months in prison for his stealing of the car. But apparently his furious driving is even worse than that, so he gets 3 years for that. But then cheeking the police is the most serious crime in this world, apparently. So he gets 15 years.
This was a very hammy scene in the book and in this version. And then rounding it up to 20. Just
to be on the safe side. And I don't know how long he spends in prison, but it has to be a while, because you see birds building a nest on his window and laying eggs and everything. So I'm going to guess he's there until at least summer, like several months anyway. But during all this time, you have the jailer's daughter taking pity on him and kind of trying to befriend him, but he's kind of oblivious to people being nice to him.
In the book, he figures that she has feelings for him. And I think he kind of regretted the gap in their class.
That was not in this version. That's hilarious.
Like, she's just trying to be nice to an animal. I think that talking about the jail scene, I keep thinking about buttered toast now.
I do remember watching that scene as a kid and thinking that buttered toast looked amazing.
It wasn't even anime.
And it was really messily and violently eaten by Mr. Toad.
Maybe it made you want to go messily and violently eat some buttered toast.
Maybe. Also, the way they animated the steam smells and all the little rats like sniffing and going after the steam. They just made it seem so delicious. You also had a little scene where he's in jail where I think he's like making friends with a group of non-sentient rats. They seem to be just like regular rats. And he's like telling them a story of what he's done. And he's like admitting that what he did was terrible and his sentence was just, but he's also very proud of himself.
I think, maybe especially for the cheek. How creative that was or whatever.
And you have interspersed with all the scenes in prison, you've got I think you said it was taken from elsewhere in the book, where Portly has gone missing. So Mole and Ratty are rowing up and down the river trying to find him. Mm-hmm. And they eventually find him being looked after by Pan.
Mm-hmm. Well, they never see Pan. Well, do they?
I guess that could be up to interpretation. They definitely notice and talk about seeing his footprints.
Right.
But at least from what we can see, he's in front of them and he's hiding Portly, petting him for a little bit, and then he disappears.
It's a weird chapter. And that's another one that's almost a short story within the book. And that's this idea that Pan is the guardian of little animals. I don't know why Kenneth Grahame made this chapter. It doesn't, like, it's very poetic, but I don't fully get it.
You could kind of tell that it had been forced into this scene. The way they talk about Toad in the conversations with Portly, it's just kind of like they're jumping back.
I don't think they talk about Toad at all in that chapter. Like, it's its own thing, kind of like the one with him going to his home again. Mm-hmm. It's like it's its own thing.
Yeah. I get the feeling that when they were putting together this movie, somebody just really liked the Pan chapter and wanted to find a way to fit it into the movie.
Maybe because you can totally tell the story without it.
Yeah. So you have to find a way to make it make sense, and I don't know that they did a perfectly good job of making it make sense within the story of Toad going to jail.
I can't remember now. Were they trying to talk a bunch about Toad during this, or...
It was like they kept changing the subject. Like they would talk about Toad, and I think Rat had a line about save your pity for Otter, his son's gone missing, or something like that.
Right, they were weaving it in.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right now, and then the whole, like, he's hearing the voice of Pan, which Rat did hear it better. Like, Mole, I don't know how much Mole could hear it. He could sense Pan, but...
Yeah, after that, you have the jailer's daughter coming to Toad with a plan to break him out of jail. She talks about her very poor aunt, who, if they help him, they don't actually say, like, she starts whispering in his ear, but you get the idea that, like, if you give my aunt some money, we'll help you get out of jail. Mm-hmm. So her aunt is a washerwoman, so they disguise Toad as her aunt so that he can get out of prison without anybody noticing.
Which in the book, I think she insisted on being tied up like she had been...
Oh, really?
Yes. Like, yeah. Yeah.
I wondered about that.
They had, she wanted, like, it wasn't going to be very convincing anyway, but she wanted it to look like.
Because when I was watching it this time, I was like, so what are the people who run the prison going to think if Toad just disappears? Are they going to, like, come after the jailer's daughter? But if the part of their plan was to make it look like he had tied up...
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Although it just adds another to the long list of crimes that they could get him on later.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So he flees prison and he hitches a ride on a train, and you meet the engine driver he seems like a nice guy, but when he finds out about Toad, he's not liking the idea of helping him, but then they're being chased by the police and he doesn't like the idea of the police telling him what to do. Mm-hmm. So he helps Toad. That cracked me up.
In the end, it is a toad.
So he basically has him jump off the train at the last second when they go through a tunnel so that he can escape. And the next morning, Toad comes across the barge woman. There's this big barge being towed by a horse, and she offers to give him a lift in exchange for washing some clothes, which he fails at hilariously, and she's laughing at him. And I love it whenever Toad gets outraged. I think I've said it before. I don't remember if it was in the episode we did a while back with Nikki or if I just said it. But, like, Toad is the kind of character that I love watching on a movie. But if I knew him in real life, I would hate this person.
Sure. I don't think I hate him in the first one. I'll save that for the sequel.
I wondered.
It's like, in the book, he is very foolish and silly and obnoxious and everything, but in the end, he is a fairly good-hearted creature. And he does change, which we'll get to later.
But yeah, he's insulting the barge woman, and he reveals himself to be Mr. Toad, which she is repulsed by. Just the fact that he's a toad, she is repulsed. So she throws him overboard. So then he goes and frees her horse.
Which is, yeah, that's a funny part in the book. What they don't include is the gypsy. The versions that we've watched so far, they have not included the gypsy. Because I think he might actually sell the horse for breakfast to a gypsy.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, in this one, he just takes the horse and rides it away, leaving her stranded in the river.
Unless he trades it for another horse and breakfast. I can't remember. I'd have to look. But yeah, there's a whole thing with a gypsy that apparently is easy to edit out. You can include Pan, but forget about the gypsy.
So he's riding this horse back home, and on the way he sees the judge who sentenced him to prison. So he freaks out, and it seems like he's feigning a heat stroke or something. So they stop to help him, and in return he hijacks and steals the judge's car.
The book is almost as silly, because in the book it's the guy that he originally stole the car from. Like, what? Did you just have animosity towards him for actually turning you into the police? What is going on with this? So yes, very foolish toad.
Mm-hmm. And then he crashes again. And then you have the line that I feel like is one that my brother's repeated a lot when he sees the police coming and he yells, "The bobbies! Catch me if you can!"
The bobbies!
And he ends up swimming to Rat and Mole. So when he gets back to Rats, they reveal that Toad Hall has been taken over by the Weasels, and then Badger reveals that he's there as well and tells him he has a plan to reclaim Toad Hall using an underground passage that Toad's father had told Badger about, but would never have dreamt of telling Toad about.
Mm-hmm.
So they sneak into Toad Hall, and this whole scene was a lot shorter than I remembered, but I think I was confusing it with the Disney version, because at some point I saw the Disney version. I think I must have conflated the two, because the battle didn't seem to last very long in this version.
Okay.
I think it was longer in the Disney one.
In the book, they get it over with pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they drive the Weasels out, reclaim the house, and then immediately start planning a party.
And this is fairly accurate in that they're trying to curb his arrogance straight off, and he sings a song to himself about how great he is.
Yeah.
Which is pretty accurate to the book, except for that's where, in the book, he has the party and, like, his friends or neighbors or whoever are expecting him to be more grandiose. And he chooses to be modest, and I think it was a bit of a downer to them, but after that he does choose to be more modest. Mm-hmm. Whereas in this one, they left it wide open. It's like he hadn't learned a single thing. And next thing you know, he's in an airplane.
Yes, his only modesty was there because of Badger forced it.
Yeah, whereas in the book, his character actually does mature and develop, which is the way I would have liked for them to cap this off. Instead of, oh great, here we go.
For me, I didn't even know that, like when I was a kid, I did not know that there was a sequel. So this seemed like an okay ending. Like, I don't think you have an airplane in this movie.
No.
It's the very beginning of the next one. So it kind of ends with him entering the banquet hall to wild applause. And then you go back to the real world. So, yeah, when I was a kid, I had no idea that there was a sequel to this. It was just, this was the only movie we had.
You were spared.
We'll get there next time. But yeah, we go back to Vanessa Redgrave with her grandchildren, having a picnic on the riverbank before going back to the boat. And she explains that Toad was forced to send gifts and money to everybody that had helped him, and that the 4 animals became legends to the Weasels, who used them as cautionary tales to their misbehaving children. That cracked me up. And then over the credits, you get some voiceovers from characters from earlier in the story. And it didn't strike me as anything when I was a kid, because I didn't know there was a sequel. But at the end, you hear the youngest boy ask what adventures they had next. Oh. So they were already planning a sequel when they made this.
Why did you do it, John Coates?
So yeah, that's the 1995 animated Wind in the Willows.
Definitely recommend.
Yeah, I really liked this one. I think I would still like it even if I hadn't grown up with it. It's a really good version.
If I am saying it's a good version and I love the book so much, hopefully that means something.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't grow up with it and I love the book, so if I wanted to be a stickler over something, if it was genuinely bad, but it can be added to, if you wanted a John Coates collection along with the Snowman and Beatrix Potter, it'd be a nice one in there.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, out of the things that we've watched, this is one that I could put in top recommendations across all genres.
Well, we'll be back next time to talk about the sequel, but until then, do you have any place you'd like to send people if they would like to find you online?
Sure. Mainly Turnip Wilson on Redbubble. I have whimsical art on there, nature and vintage illustration inspired pieces. I like to work with watercolor and pen and ink.
Okay. Well, we will see you next time to talk about The Willows in Winter.
All right. Bye.
Thanks for listening to Every Version Ever. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe and follow my co-hosts as well. My Linktree and all of our links will be in the description below. If you want more of my content, all my podcasts are available on YouTube as well as most podcast platforms. If you enjoyed this show, check out one of the other podcasts or check out my Patreon for bonus and extended episodes you won't find anywhere else. We'll be back soon with another brand new episode, so thanks for listening and we'll see you next time.